Convention of States and the Supreme Court and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And we have with us today the Convention of States folks from Maryland. First, the state director from the state of Maryland, Stephen Patten, and Matthew Rehberg, who is also with the Convention of States. And Matthew, what is your official title?
I'm a volunteer. I've been jumping around from one job to another, so
Understood.
I'm a utility man.
And the Convention of States, you have heard us talk to these folks before. Today's going to be a lot more in-depth about the Convention of States and why it's so relevant, especially in light of this election that's coming up. It's more relevant now than ever. But first, I want to thank our assistant producer, Christopher Hopkins, and our producer, Adam Katura. Christopher is here with us all the time, and he is the millennial that's here today, without question. So first up, we're going to redefine again for our listeners, because we're going to go not just to talk about the Convention of States and what they do and their objectives, but also term limits, and now with the judiciary, with the nomination of Judge Amy Barrett, what that really means and how the Dems are trying to expand potentially the Supreme Court, although they're not willing to answer the question. We're going to talk about all of those issues, plus the dumbest bill in America. So first up, what is the Convention of States?
You want to take this, Matt?
Sure. The Convention of States Action Movement is a nationwide movement in order to do what I would term to be two things. One is to utilize the Article 5 process to amend the Constitution under three categories. One, term limits. Two, fiscal restraints. And three, federal overreach. And we can get into a whole entire podcast episode just talking about each one of those separately.
Absolutely.
So I won't get into too much detail, but that's basically the bottom line of that portion. The other aspect of it is to generate a grassroots effort to get the average citizen, the ordinary American across the country involved into politics. Get in contact with your national representatives, get in contact with your state representatives, and even in your local government. And so the more people that get informed, the more we can influence, as we the people can influence what goes on in government.
And what does Article 5 call for specifically? Now, just for the podcast listeners, this is Article 5 of the United States Constitution. And it does spell out, and I'm just going to set this up for the Convention of States guests today, it does spell out the mechanism by which you can have a convention of some sorts to amend the Constitution of the United States. My understanding is there are two ways. So spell those out.
Correct, yeah. Article 5 of the Constitution is how we change the Constitution. The framers and the founders found that there was going to be a time when things needed to be added, taken away, changed. And on the federal level, the way that's done is through Article 5. Article 5 has two sections. The first section is how we've gotten the 27 amendments we have to date, which is 2/3 of Congress, the federal Congress, propose an amendment.
Okay.
That amendment then goes back to the state legislatures, and 3/4 of those state legislatures, both sides of the state legislatures, need to ratify, say, yes,
okay,
we approve this becoming an amendment to the Constitution. That's how the 27 we have been enacted and ratified. The second clause of Article 5 takes that power away from Congress to propose amendments to the states. The second half stays the same. It still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states once it's proposed. But the proposal part of it is what's different. The states can come together to propose an amendment. The states, 2/3 of the states have to get together and agree on what the conversation's going to be at that meeting.
And that is a convention of states.
The states.
Okay.
And that's a meeting of all the states are invited, even though only 2/3 of them propose the idea of getting together. But they have a structure of what they're allowed to talk about. And those are the resolutions that we're trying to have passed in the individual state legislatures across the country to actually call that meeting to propose amendments under the subject matter that we've delineated.
Now, we talked about this the last time you guys were on, but what we didn't do is go into a lot more detail, which is what we're going to do in this podcast, especially in light of this election and some of the things that we're hearing during this election that are literally a full frontal attack on the United States Constitution. And so first up, I wanted to talk about term limits and what the Convention of States wants to do on term limits, or are there any specifics about term limits?
So I'll jump in real quick. The specificity will all take place at the convention. So the bottom line up front, the specificity of the amendments being proposed would occur at that convention.
Okay.
So the term limits that we're talking about would be term limits applied to the representatives in the House of Representatives of Congress, term limits applied to the senators in the Senate, as well as potentially to the justices on the Supreme Court.
So this is all the federal level that you're talking about, just the federal level as it relates to the United States Constitution. Now, I did hear you at the end about the judiciary. We're going to talk about that in a little while, which is kind of interesting. But the term limits, are there any specific term limits that COS is, the Convention of States, is trying to apply to the Constitution? Any framework?
The framework would be discussed and debated at the actual convention.
Okay.
So we have all, as individuals, we have our own ideas, maybe, whatever they are, 12 years for senators, 12 years for Supreme Court justices. Under our subject matter of our application, the resolution that we're trying to pass here in Maryland and has passed in 15 states across the country, there's no structure to term limits, but that there should be a conversation about term limits for Congress, the judiciary, and federal bureaucrats.
Okay. So for the House of Representatives, for the United States Senate, for bureaucrats, interesting, and for the judiciary.
Correct.
And that should be just a conversation that occurs at the Convention of States. But the Convention of States organization itself is not setting the guidelines as to specifically the term limits that they're looking for.
That's correct.
Interesting. So let's talk about term limits themselves of United States congressmen and United States senators. So Joe Biden, been in office for 47 years, as an example.
It's a long time.
And to be fair, there are plenty of Republicans who have been in office for a very long time as well. Mitch McConnell being one of them.
Correct.
I don't recall how long he's been in office, but it's pretty much been most of his adult life. Certainly it's all of Joe Biden's adult life. So what would you do? What would you do in terms of starting off the conversation to justify why that is necessary?
I got a couple of points just to throw out there, and then I'll turn over to Steve for any additional. But one justification is that when the founders wrote the Constitution, they never thought there would be any career politicians. There was no intentions. Now, again,
Why did they think that?
Well, first of all, the lifespan in 1776 was much shorter than it is today, right? The healthcare of
Great
today
point.
allowed people to have an average lifespan in the 70s, whereas back then, I think it was in the 30s. So we're talking about double the length of the average lifespan for a person. So a career politician was just not a consideration. Plus, back then in 1776, nobody was just a politician. Everybody was a farmer or an inventor or a scientist or a publicist.
We were largely an agrarian society.
Correct.
Right.
So you had to go home and farm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you actually had a real job. Otherwise, your family didn't eat.
Correct.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And so moving on to the other part of your question is what would this look like? What was some possibilities here? And so the one way I like to frame it is let's throw out the number 12 that Steve threw out real quick.
Okay. So 12-year limit.
We'll just put to talk as a possible example,
Okay.
12-year limit. So here's what I'd like to propose, or at least not propose, but just to consider. Imagine for a moment 12 years in the House of Representatives, and there's many House of representatives in the House of Representatives. Was it 457, somewhere around there?
435.
35. Thank you for the correction.
So there are 435 members, but they serve in the House, which is the lower house at the federal level in the United States. They serve for 2 years. They have to run every 2 years, which basically means they're running all the time.
Right, absolutely. So imagine for a moment that there's 8 representatives from Maryland. Imagine that a couple of them have done really, really well for those 12 years, and now we elect them to a position in the Senate. Now, the ones that don't get elected, they'd finish their 12 years, and then maybe we elect 1 or 2 of them to a Senate position.
Maybe they'll go down to the state legislatures and try to start all over again.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then if they're in the Senate for, let's say, 12 years, right, 2 terms, right? The senators have a 6-year term. They're in there for 2 terms. They're in there for 12 years. And then maybe one of them is really, really good, and now they can run for president. And so it's almost like a business where you start at the low level and you work your way up, instead of just being in the same position for decades and decades on end, just as an example.
And we've had these conversations, I guess, there was a simulated Convention of States where representatives from all the states came together in Williamsburg, Virginia, and had these conversations. And the conversations were great, and you can watch a lot of the video, actually, at the conventionofstates.com website.
I've watched that. It's very good.
It's very interesting, too, and it's very, the people sitting around those tables and talking took it very seriously, even though it was a simulation.
And really podcast listeners, just to say this again for the podcast listeners, what is the website where you can go watch this?
It's everything for Convention of States is housed on our website, conventionofstates.com. Conventionofstates.com.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So these conversations have been had, and the number that 12 number is kind of what has been battered about. Some people think it should be more like 18 or even 24, where you have a combination of years in the House, years in the Senate. So somewhere that 12, 18, those are numbers that are battered around and we talk about. What I find really interesting about the term limit side is that we can also have conversations about the federal judiciary. That falls under our resolution as well. And I know you're going to go into that, but the other thing is on federal bureaucrats, the head of a...
Let's talk about the bureaucrats. So bureaucrats, to be fair, these are civil servants. They work for the federal government. Because let's just keep this at the federal level, because that's what we're talking about, is term limits for members of the United States Congress, for the United States Senate. And then also you're talking about federal employees who are bureaucrats. All federal employees?
Well, I think the conversation would go towards probably the heads of departments, like the head of the EPA or maybe the head of the CDC or the infectious disease department.
Generally speaking, those heads are appointed by the President of the United States.
Correct.
And the President of the United States is indeed term limited to 2 terms, each term being 4 years. So he's limited, or she is limited to 8 years.
Correct. And we saw how the very few that President Trump ousted were so few were actually approved and put back into positions.
So many were holdovers from the Obama administration.
And the few that he did boot and want to change, he couldn't get approval for. Whatever they tied it up with, security clearances.
Thus the term the deep state. It just seems like it perpetuates itself.
Correct.
So that is the principal reason. So what you're saying is term limits for the appointees.
The head of the departments.
Or the head of the departments, or the true decision makers. Maybe in each department it's the top 100 people, potentially. I don't know. Because I'm
less.
not. Okay. Or less. Okay. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That this is now going to get into a little bit of the overreach aspect of the Convention of States movement. But when Congress passes a law, a lot of times, like for example, like the environment, right? They pass a law, they want clean air, clean water, but they don't actually put into the law the how to accomplish this. And that's where the executive branch comes in, but the bureaucrats in the executive branch would then establish the policies those policies...
It's the rulemaking.
Right, the rulemaking, and that get enforced. And so
Congress isn't making rules.
Instead of the legislative branch, who's supposed to make the rules, who's supposed to make the laws, and then the executive branch enforce them, it's now the executive branch that's actually creating the rules and enforcing them.
Interesting. So I get that. Any examples of any specific rulemaking that is occurring, let's say, on a regular basis or changing, that Congress basically gave up its authority to make the law to an agency, a federal agency, and that federal agency is kind of running away with it?
The one that always sticks in my side, like a thorn, is the EPA, where I couldn't put a pond on my property, and if I did, I could be fined. And a legislator has absolutely no say over that. There's a regulation that says I can't dig a hole in my backyard for whatever the reasoning is, and I can actually go to jail for that. And that is, however they drew it up, it's now a law, but it never went. I never voted for the person who made that a law.
Right, so basically it's unelected bureaucrats that are doing that. So there's an argument, it's interesting, and I want obviously clearly to have the COS's opinion on this. So at the state legislature level, which I am intimately familiar with, podcast listeners, when I came in, I was shocked at how immense the bureaucracy is in a state, at the state level. The bureaucracy is so enormous that what I learned was that it took me a solid 7 years to 8 years just to learn about how that bureaucracy worked, because it literally is a full-time job to learn how the bureaucracy works because it's so incredibly complex, unnecessarily so. And what?
And then you had to learn how to navigate it.
And then
once you found out it was there.
and yes. And then the other interesting thing that I learned, and this in many ways supports your point, but may also challenge it, is that the bureaucracy, the departments at the state level, and this happens at the federal level too, the bureaucracies at the state level have full-time government affairs people whose job it is to come to the state house on the Senate side and the House side and lobby on behalf of the department against any laws that you're trying to pass that might undermine their authority to do the things that they want to do. So in other words, you got elected by the people sent you to office to make changes. You put a bill in, and one of the bills is, I want there to be less regulation for land use on commercial land. And then you have the State Department of the Environment coming in with their lobbyist that's paid for by the taxpayer saying, well, we don't like this bill and we're going to testify against it because this kind of like takes away our authority to do what the law says. And you're like, yeah, but I'm a lawmaker. I have that right to change the law. And that's how bad it is. And my point is it took a solid 7 to 8 years to not just learn who these people were, but how it worked. And you guys, and by the way, also giving you major credibility about this, that it's even worse than I thought, the bureaucracy is. It's actually worse than I thought. And so how does a convention of states fix that problem at the federal level, which we know is exponentially worse than the state level, whereby it brings in reins in the bureaucracy, their bureaucratic powers? What would that look like in terms of a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, I don't think we can go into any specific type of amendment, but I'll give you one example. Back a long time ago when we had the Prohibition Amendment, right? They banned alcohol as a constitutional amendment. And it was such an unpopular amendment to the Constitution amongst the citizens of the country that movement, a convention of states-like movement that existed to repeal that, was so popular and so close to being the first one to ever be called as a convention of states, that Congress woke up and repealed it themselves. So back to my second point earlier on, we want that grassroots effort. We want the average citizen to become informed and get involved into the politics and what goes on in the country. If we had more of that, then maybe it wouldn't require a constitutional amendment to fix the overreach. It would just require the citizens of the country to be contacting their legislators and informing them that this is not acceptable.
Yeah, I think shining light on a problem and even talking about it can really help bring attention to it. One of the things we say in our volunteer duties is reach, teach, activate. We need to reach people with our message. We want to teach them how to become activists, and then we want them to become activists. I think more conversations like this being had about these things and letting people know, like you said, you got into the system, you didn't even know it was there.
No, I didn't.
And we reach people and we get the message to them and let them know it's, light, shining a little light on something can cure a lot of ills, but you got to get the light on it. You got to let people know that it's even there and that it's a problem. So raising just the fact that we said in the beginning of the conversation, it was said that, well, we want to put, term limits on federal bureaucrats as well. A light bulb went off and you said, well, how would that work? Well, there's that conversation being had now.
So the purpose of COS is really to just kickstart, among other things, that conversation, but other conversations as well, but certainly about
Absolutely.
bureaucrats, which is interesting because, look, I agree that Congress has ceded immense authority to bureaucracies to rulemaking and make laws. Rulemaking is lawmaking, without question. And Congress has done that because why?
They need to get
It's easier
elected
to
every
do
2
that
years.
than it is to make a lot of people mad than to just do the right thing, right? Which is to just pass a law on a single subject so that people can easily understand it and then pass it and people hold you accountable one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, I don't know if you probably know this better than I do, but if you look at the approval ratings for Congress has rarely reached double digits approval rating. They haven't been above 25% in the last 10 years, other than maybe 3 possible polls in the last 10 years.
I'm sure. That's why I'm laughing.
But what's really interesting,
Polio rate's higher than Congress.
but what's really interesting is that the approval rating for individual representatives and legislators by their constituents is always much, much higher. So I approve of my guy, but I don't approve of the whole organization, and yet nothing changes. If you look at the statistics over the average number of seats that are actually contested in an election, in 430, I forgot the number you told me, but 435 representatives in the House of Representatives, usually it's only 5 that are contested, and they're elected every 2 years. Only about 5 at most 10 seats are ever contested in an individual election.
Incumbency is amazingly powerful.
And yet all 435 are up for grabs every single election.
Which is probably why, I guess, if you're in the United States House of Representatives or the Senate, and you're one of those guys that has a super safe seat, you probably aren't going to listen very much to the average citizen who comes to you and complains about a specific rulemaking issue that was made by the bureaucracy, because you're going to go, well, I'm not going to listen to them because that's just one vote and my seat is safe. And they're so risk averse that they don't want to challenge the bureaucracy. And look, to be fair, I think this president is really the first president in modern American history, certainly since Reagan, to challenge the bureaucracy and shake it up and also expose its weaknesses, namely that you have people in the deep state who are there forever and they're always constantly moving forward their agenda, and because they can, because Congress gave them that authority to do it. That actually has always, to be honest with you, has always made me so incredibly surprised once getting into elective government at the state level. At the federal level, I can only imagine the level of power these bureaucrats have.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've heard people discuss that bureaucrats, they're more powerful than the people that appoint them, as in the president, because they're entrenched. They're not going anywhere. And the president's going to switch every 4 to 8 years. No, you're fine, Mark.
No, I was going to say because I had this afterthought that I started before about the term limits, responding to you guys, and that was always my concern about term limits is, first of all, I believe in term limits, and I think it's a great idea, and I think it's wonderful you guys are taking this up. But once again, I now get why you guys want to include trying to term limit the bureaucracy as well, because they're intertwined. Because the bureaucracy, they are really running the government. Politicians aren't running the government. And that is that's a learned thing. It's really a surprise to me. And to the extent that a politician is in for just one term or 2 terms, they have no idea how the government's really run, which is why we probably need to have a convention of states to have this conversation to begin with.
And we do hear that objection a lot, that if term limits aren't, we can already term them, we vote them out. We hear that a lot. Well, they are term limited, they just don't vote for them. And the problem with that is the incumbency, the power of the incumbent and the party behind them once they're in place, and they are very unwilling to give up that
and the
power.
way the district is drawn is often,
and that's affected.
It's drawn so that no one will ever win on the other side, because it is drawn in a really kind of unfair way.
Yeah.
We have many examples of that.
And
Steny Hoyer.
Yep.
I also like to say that if term limits for the president of the United States if term limits is good enough for the president of the United States, then it's good enough for everybody else.
Absolutely. So the Convention of the States also, you guys mentioned the judiciary, and we're having this big discussion at the national level about the judiciary, because Judge Amy Barrett has been nominated to the Supreme Court. And of course, that's the nation's highest court, so that's why all eyes are on that court, because there's a new nominee in a presidential election year. But according to you guys, COS now thinks that maybe we should have a conversation in a convention of states about Supreme Court term limits. Now,
Agreed.
Currently, the Constitution of the United States says what about term limits? For Supreme Court, I mean.
It's a lifetime appointment.
So you get appointed to the Supreme Court, and you're on there forever until the day that you die or the day that you decide to leave voluntarily.
And you can be impeached. You can be
impeached. You can be removed.
According to Article 3, for bad behavior.
So why do we need term limits for the Supreme Court?
I think it's obvious in that why is there so much attention being paid to one Supreme Court justice nomination every time it happens? Because they're in their 30s, it's a lifetime appointment, and we've also given the court way too much power and way too much say over us. They shouldn't be the final arbiter, and I don't believe the founders and the framers drew up the Constitution. They're supposed to be the the zebras. They're the guys in the striped uniform supposed to be calling balls and strikes.
Why don't we fix that then? Because the same Congress that has ceded control to the bureaucracy is the same Congress that has decided to cede control and legislating to the Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court's not supposed to legislate.
I would say
why
the
not
executive
tighten
branch,
that up in the Constitution?
That is a conversation that can be had, but that really comes back to Congress taking their power given to them in the Constitution back and stop ceding it. They have to, as a group, they need to do that. I think there's an argument to say that the president should do that too. Just because 9 judges say, you can't put citizenship question on the census. He can still put that citizenship question on the census. They don't have their own law enforcement agency under them to.
They're supposed to interpret it in accordance with the text of the United States Constitution, and they're not doing that. So maybe it's a tightening up of the Constitution itself rather than term limits for the Supreme Court. Maybe
to that question, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That specific.
And the question: how does one do that?
I was just going to add in there that the Constitution already has built into it the checks and balances between the three branches of the government, right? So, even if the judiciary declares a law to be unconstitutional, technically Congress can overrule that with enough votes
to make a law
in their House of Representatives and the Senate. And so across the board, the three branches just have checks and balances, and they're all supposed to be three independent of each other, right? So it's not. I mean, of course, you want each person to be working with each other. You want the president working with Congress. You do want some, co-synchronization, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. But the people voted in a president. The people voted in their Congress, and the three separate branches are supposed to be checks. And are checking each other and balancing each other's levels of power, not working as one entire unit to take the power away from the states and away from the people.
When there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, what does the Constitution say specifically about that vacancy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually have it highlighted right here, and it says under Article 2, Section 2 for the president shall nominate and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint and then ambassadors, public ministers, counsels, and judges of the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Shall.
So the word shall is used, not may. So it says the president. So the president means whoever's the president at that particular time because they were elected and they are the president. The Constitution does it speak to anything like if there's an election year, the president shall not?
Nope, no caveats.
It just says shall, the president shall.
Yep.
Interesting. So we have this real-time nominee, which is Judge Amy Barrett, and she's being attacked from every side, including from the side of, well, why would a president have the right to nominate any judge to the Supreme Court if he's in an election year? But the Constitution doesn't actually speak to that. It actually uses the word shall.
That's correct. And so go back to the term limits real quick. I think this constitutional crisis that we are in right now, I think could have been alleviated by a term limit amendments for the Supreme Court justices. Ruth Bader Ginsburg chose not to step down when she initially was diagnosed with cancer under the Obama administration. My understanding is that she wanted her replacement to be selected by Hillary Clinton, assuming that Hillary was going to win the presidency. That didn't work out, so she was waiting for the next president after Trump. And so basically she was trying to pick her successor. Term limits would eliminate that because then she would be term limited out, and whoever the president is at the time when she would be term limited out would choose that replacement whatever year that would take.
But we could also say the Constitution worked in that sense because she was unsuccessful in choosing her successor because of her own hubris. Her own hubris and just thinking that she was just so great that everybody was going to want to replace her with someone just like her, and that Hillary would just be elected. That's I'm just obviously this is part of my job is to play the other side of
Sure.
this. It's just, what do you think?
Well, I think term limits on the judiciary has way more positives, way more pros than cons, in all honesty. I think people are going to be upset. I think the conversation is going to go if, say, the Convention of States is called and judicial term limits becomes a topic of conversation. I think what you're going to be debating at that point is when do we start rolling out the current judges? At what pace? Do we break it up into thirds, quarters? The two currently longest standing, are they the first two out? And that conversation will be had at a Convention of States. And I'm really curious to hear that conversation of how that would work. I don't see a downside to putting term limits on the judiciary. I just don't see a big picture downside to it.
So one of the things that Democrats are doing with Judge Amy Barrett is they're using religion, and they're trying to establish a religious test. And we've seen this before when JFK, John F. Kennedy, was running for president of the United States. I believe it was 1960. That was the big question. It was called the Catholic question. Can a guy running for president be Catholic and then win and without having the Pope tell him what to do? Because that was the conventional wisdom at that particular time. And it's interesting because the Constitution, we're going to get to that because we're going to have you guys read it. The Constitution actually already solved that problem for us and for good reason. But we have a couple of clips of JFK to bring us back to almost like Back to the Future, the movie, right? Because here we are talking about Judge Amy Barrett all over again, and we're Back to the Future talking about the Catholic question. And it does give a lot of credibility to what COS is trying to accomplish here. First, we have the first of two clips of JFK. Here we go.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
Yeah, so there you go. So he had to actually find it necessary, JFK did, to explain himself in quite a lengthy speech to give some sort of assurance to the American people that, you know, the Pope wasn't going to have him on the hotline, the red phone, and say, this is what you need to do. But we're having the same conversation now about Judge Amy Barrett. Here's the second of two clips with JFK.
Made him a real leader.
If this election is decided on the basis that 40 million Americans lost their chance of being president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people.
And here is Judge Amy Barrett being excoriated by Senator Dianne Feinstein, in September of 2017, so many years later after JFK found it necessary to try to set the record straight, JFK being a Democrat, and now we have a Democrat at the national level, a United States Senator, going back to the religious test. So going back to the future. And this is when Judge Amy Barrett was being questioned in 2017 to be on the federal bench. And we have that clip, and here it is.
Dogma and law are two different things. And I think in your case, Professor, when you read your speeches, the conclusion one draws is that the dogma lives loudly within you.
So there you have it. What does the Constitution of the United States say as it relates to a religious test?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because it actually does have the words religious test. It's in Article 6, Section 3. And if I may, Mark, I will read it. The senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States.
It's just amazing. Amazing how forward-thinking the Founding Fathers were. Why were they forward-thinking on this issue?
Well, I'd say that when the country was founded, Maryland, we're here in Maryland, so I'll speak to that. Maryland was a Catholic state.
Catholic sanctuary.
Yep, the original Constitution, the representatives for the state legislature had to be Catholic, and I think there were other states that were similar with other religions.
But in Maryland, people were fleeing England because Catholics were being persecuted.
Correct.
So Maryland was a place they could go and freely worship. And understanding the fact that so many wars over so many years had been started as a result of religion, and people of different religions were being discriminated against throughout history, the Founding Fathers had the knowledge of history and then implemented that in the Constitution of the United States to say, you know what, we shouldn't have a religious test
Absolutely.
for people on the Supreme Court and on the judiciary. And then here we are, back to the future, where we thought we won this argument in 1960 with JFK, and here we are with Judge Amy Barrett, and the Democrats have brought this back. And this relates to COS because what you guys are saying, at least my understanding is, the fundamental principle of COS is we have a Constitution. For whatever reason, it isn't being followed. And in fact, we're going backwards in time and embracing the ugly history of the past. So why don't we embrace the Constitution? Maybe we need a convention of the states to remind people that this actually exists and maybe strengthen it in some way.
Yeah, Mark, I go back to what Steve said a minute ago about reach, teach, activate, that whole educate yourself. So for your podcast listeners out there, the Article 5 Day was just a few weeks ago when the Constitution was signed. I would take the time to read the Constitution. I would say it's not an easy read, but it's very well written, and it is straightforward. There's so many things written in here that really are just clear as day. They're clear as day, and they're straightforward. Take the time to read the Constitution because it just seems like not very many people that are in the public eye have. I mean, we can on CNN, was it Chris Cuomo who talking about protests?
Where does it say peaceful?
Right, so where does it say peaceful? It's
right in the Constitution.
Right in the Constitution, Amendment 1.
Really, it says that.
It does say that.
So let's read that for us.
Sure.
That's awesome.
Sure. Amendment 1 to the Constitution related to religion as well as other rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Interesting how we have lockdowns that were established basically by bureaucrats, like health departments nationwide, that have, among other things, in many cases, not all jurisdictions, but in many jurisdictions, told churches and synagogues and mosques they can't meet. In fact, they can't meet at all. They can't even meet outside in some cases. And that's being violated right now.
It's basically 2 of the 5 right there in Amendment 1, religion and assembly.
And it does seem that COS is kind of one of those groups that, and certainly one of the largest groups, that is really trying to remind people the importance of this Constitution. And this goes to my next question for you guys, because this has always been a big question I have, which is, what is the penalty for like a United States senator or United States congressman when they try to thwart the United States Constitution? In other words, instead of being constructive and saying, hey, if you don't like this, then we should have a constitutional amendment or a convention of states, and that's how we can fix it, versus what we're currently hearing from like Chuck Schumer, where he threatened the existing Supreme Court justices if they didn't rule in a way that he wanted to, and a threat against the judiciary, or against any judge for that matter, or any American, is usually it's a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the level of the threat. Thoughts? I mean, how do we strengthen that?
I'm afraid we're going to go back to the reach, teach, activate, that so many people don't understand the Constitution and they don't know their own rights. They don't. The Constitution was written, I think it was John Adams who said, for a religious and moral people. Right now, it's too hard to amend the Constitution with a convention of states. It's too hard to amend the Constitution with coming out the way the last 27 have. It's too hard. It's easier to get, I like the term gaslighting. It's easier for politicians and elected officials to gaslight, to get their way, to create sometimes it's a legitimate fear, sometimes it's a made-up fear.
It's a great term, gaslight, because that's what it seems like it.
To answer your question about how do we get the politicians, I don't know if many of your podcast listeners realize, but there are many laws, and I don't have any specific examples handy, but there are many laws in which the politicians actually are exempt. And so imagine
Social Security.
Imagine a constitutional amendment that prohibits the federal legislators or any federal politician to be exempt from any law that they pass. I think that you'd probably
That's
see
a great start.
You'd probably see some more quality laws come out of Congress.
And more enforcement as well. So, case in point, here's Senator Chuck Schumer. I have a clip of him on March 4th. You've heard this clip before, but it's certainly relevant to this conversation, where a federal politician threatens Supreme Court justices because they may or may not do what he wants, but he threatens them. And here it is.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you. if you go forward with these awful decisions.
If any American who were not an elected official, certainly at the federal level, if any American said the same thing as that, they would probably be getting a visit from the FBI, and rightfully so, because if my neighbor were to say that about me, or if my neighbor were to say the same thing about another neighbor, that if you don't do what I want you to do, like including cutting the grass down that line the way I want it, you will pay the price. And of course, the subtext there is that this person's going to hurt you. Then that is cause for contacting the local police and having them visit this gentleman and say, look, you can't do that. There's a certain amount of civility that we all agree to that we should have. And this is the danger. And that's why I ask you guys, since you're from Convention of the States, it seems like that there's that missing thing, and I don't know what it is, by the way. I don't have an answer to this. I don't know if it's a constitutional amendment or some sort of strengthening of a part of the Constitution or what have you. Maybe it's just a law whereby a senator like Schumer, and it could be a Republican too, who go and gaslight like this and excite violence, should themselves have some sort of penalty put against them. And maybe it's a pretty stiff fine. I think if you went to Chuck and you said, hey, Chuck, there's a $100,000 fine, not from free speech, because I think you can't, as you know, there's free speech and then there's the speech that is inciting violence. Go ahead.
I think that was a threat. I think he verbally threatened sitting Supreme Court justices. And I don't know about the law, and I don't have an answer to how you pose that question. But what I first thought to myself was, why didn't doesn't the Senate as a body, can it censure, or don't they have like their own internal workings that could put an end to that? Because you would think the majority of sitting senators looked at that and were appalled. But nothing happened internally.
So that's a great point. Like they do. Of course, the Senate has a censure process, which would make great sense. But the censure process, usually in the real world of politics and legislatures, you get censured, which on its face is supposed to be embarrassing, but ultimately meaningless unless you strip that person of any authority whatsoever. And the way you do that, if you're the Senate leader like Mitch McConnell, and the person is from the other side, is you say, look, you can't go there. And because you did, those committees that you wanted to be on, you're off all of them. In fact, you're on no committee. And moreover, we're not even consider any of the legislation that you want to move forward that helps your state. That's really the only thing that you have in a legislature to scold someone in reality. But it's a great point. And it does work if it actually is enforced.
Yeah, and you also made a good point, Mark, about the freedom of speech aspect of it too. I mean, everyone has the right to freedom of speech. However, you can't say fire in a crowded movie theater, right? That is not protected by the freedom.
Because you're going to get hurt on the way out, through the panic.
You're going to cause people deliberately harm, right? And I know Senator Schumer walked that back the next day. He tried to say, well, what the whirlwind I was talking about was on elections in the vote, but in this day and age, when everything is on the internet, everything's misconstrued, and there's so much miscommunication from both sides of the aisle, you really do have to choose your words properly. You have to use the right tone. You have to use the right words. And we need our politicians. We need our leaders to be good leaders. We need them to express themselves properly so that we understand what they mean and we can follow along properly. And the other aspect of it is that, again, the checks and balances, right? He called out 2 justices by name. There's 9 justices on the Supreme Court, right? So there is a checks and balance process that is according to the Constitution, the law of the land, and it's got to be followed. And you don't have to like it, but you're stuck with it.
And the interesting thing is, it's a great point, by the way, great points from both of you. It's the thing that really blows me away about this, what Schumer did, is he's calling out the 2 Catholic justices. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because of the religious text in the United States Constitution, and because Chuck Schumer is himself Jewish. And there was a time in Germany when that kind of insightful language was used to give kind of an okay to the German people to go ahead and break the windows and loot the businesses of Jewish merchants. And here you have things coming full circle where you have a Jewish senator saying, that doesn't matter, I'm not going to follow the Constitution. And this is why I find it absolutely fascinating. COS's opinion on this is well, it's not the COS opinion. It's their approach is at least to have that conversation about term limits to the Supreme Court. So here's Schumer again on why there shouldn't be Senate hearings on Judge Amy Barrett. I mean, once again, violating the United States Constitution. And here it is.
Mitch McConnell seems to be jamming through the hearings on Amy Coney Barrett, even though 3 senators have COVID, even though he has said it's not safe for the Senate to meet in session, but it's okay to have the hearings. It makes no sense. If it's not safe for the Senate to meet in session, it's not safe for the hearings to go forward. And the idea of having virtual hearings where no one is with the witness for the highest court in the land, for a life appointment that would have such effect on people's lives, makes no sense.
And so therein lies, another politician hack, once again, Schumer, trying to undermine the Constitution of the United States because the Constitution clearly says that President shall, and the Senate, of course, is supposed to take up the issue of confirmation and hearings, and at least that's the rules that the Senate has established, and Mitch McConnell is going to have those hearings, and you got Schumer saying, well, that's not because no one is there. Well, everybody is there. They're there virtually, and they all see each other, and they all have an opportunity to question. So here's my point to you guys. I'm just wondering if there's something that can be put in the Constitution to strengthen. Maybe it's something as simple as the fact that we have a really dead media, and if we had a really good media, the media could then say after they reported this, because this was all over the media, this clip, afterwards saying, oh, by the way, here's what the Constitution says. So, and it says the word shall, it says no religious test, and just go down that list. Thoughts?
Well, I would just say, Mark, that as far as the media goes, that's why I listen to your podcast more regularly now. So
thank you. Hear that, podcast listeners? Listen, subscribe. Subscribe. There, see, I'm pointing to it right there. Go ahead. Go ahead. Before we get to the dumbest bill in America, because that's up next.
I'm not sure. That's just poor leadership. Yeah, that's Schumer playing politics and raising red flags and, again, gaslighting to try to pull the attention off of what is true and what is in the Constitution. He's trying to, with his cohorts in the media, take everyone's eye off the ball and away from the truth.
But see, this is why I think COS is a good organization, because I really feel like if for no other reason, COS should serve as the educator of what the Constitution actually says and why it says those things, because of the need for the rule of law, among many other things, and educate people, because obviously it's not happening in school. It's not happening in K-12. People graduate and they have no clue about anything.
I was going to make a couple points, Mark, real quick. But for podcast listeners, if you don't hear dead air and me saying about 4 or 5 times, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Chris, for editing those out. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll edit that out. No problem.
But I wanted to say a couple points on the nomination. One, the religious question, her religious question. One way to just solve that problem is ask her directly if Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, passed a law that made the Catholic religion the national religion of the United States and signed into law by the President of the United States.
Great question.
What would you do, or what would you say, or how would you debate that? And Amy Barrett, being a Catholic, I have no doubt, although we should ask her, but I have no doubt that she would strike that down as unconstitutional.
Of course, and she would say so publicly and here's why.
Right, absolutely.
Because it says so, there shall be no religious test.
Absolutely. So I just shortened the 30 days of the nomination hearings down to about a 30-second
24 hours, yeah.
Right. And the second point that I wanted to make about this is this election is going to be extremely contested. If you're paying attention at all to what's going on to the news, you know that this is going to be a highly the voter turnout's expected to be very high. The election is supposed to be very close. It's going to be very contested. Do you really want an even number of justices on the Supreme Court? We haven't seen this kind of election since, I think, 1876. where it was this close, this contested. And no, I don't think you're going to want even number. You don't want this to be a 4-4 vote in the Supreme Court. You are going to want some confidence that the election was done fairly and executed properly.
Got it. So next up, we have the dumbest bill in America, and it's the dumbest bill in America. Do we have a lead up, Mr. Assistant Producer? Of course. And here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is the Hawaii ghost gun ban. You heard that right. It's the Hawaii ghost gun ban introduced by Senator Karl Rhodes. To be fair, he's the advocate for banning ghost guns, and there are others who have put their names on this bill, but as a leader in the Senate in Hawaii, the state Senate, he is pushing this. So it's Senate Bill 2151, introduced this year by Senator Karl Rhodes of Hawaii, and it's called the Hawaii Ghost Gun Ban. So we have 3 clips from Senator Karl Rhodes, and we're going to discuss this. This is a really important issue. First of all, he's going to tell us about what a ghost gun is. This is he being State Senator Karl Rhodes of Senate Bill 2151. Here's the first of 3 clips. Here it is.
What about ghost guns? Are we going to try to, what are they, and are we going to try to do something to stop it?
Well, ghost guns are guns that probably most people are aware now that there's something called a 3D printer. So instead of making a copy of a flat piece of paper, you can copy whatever the physical thing is. You could copy.
It's amazing. You can do that.
Yeah, you could copy a couch. You could copy a CD, an iPhone or something like that.
So there you go. He's defining for you what a 3D printer is and what a ghost gun is. So a 3D printer is a printer that actually uses the printing technology to actually make things, physical things, not just copy a piece of paper, obviously. It's actually making something. And there's the not just possibility, but the actual reality that a 3D printer can now make the parts of a gun, if not an entire gun, that can ultimately be assembled and be a functioning gun. And so the Democrats have very cleverly called these ghost guns because, of course, it's always about scaring people rather than calling it 3D printed guns. You know, that would probably make a lot more sense because it would be based on science rather than trying to scare people. But Senator Karl Rhodes of Hawaii wants to ban these. And he's going to explain this a little bit in his next clip before we go to discussion. And here is the clip.
There are, unfortunately, there is software has been invented to do that for guns as well. There are ongoing court cases about it, and there's actually a federal injunction saying that the company that's doing the software cannot put it out there. Injunctions like that are also hard to enforce. So
right. Once it's on the internet, how do you take it down?
I suspect that somewhere in the dark corners of the internet you could find them, even though there's an injunction against it.
Oh my gosh, people might make their own guns, according to State Senator Karl Rhodes. Well, let's read what the Second Amendment actually says in the Bill of Rights, right?
I got it right here.
Let's hear it.
So, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Shall not be infringed. So let's think about this for a minute. We have people rioting in the streets of the United States of America in major cities, and major business districts in major cities are literally boarded up and in some cases destroyed, many blocks destroyed. Many of these businesses not coming back, people feeling unsafe. I have personal friends in the nation's capital who want to sell their condo because they walk out their door and they feel fundamentally unsafe, and they live in a great area, but took the risk. And they're young. They're millennials themselves. And so then we have a Democrat Party who clearly wants to stack the court, the Supreme Court, which we were talking about briefly before. And in so doing, one of the things they want to do is what? They want to basically try to find a way of getting rid of and putting the kibosh on the Second Amendment. And of course, State Senator Karl Rhodes of Hawaii, in the ghost gun ban, as he calls it, what he wants to do is basically say, well, this is just one more way you can use to protect yourself by making your own gun. And in normal times, we could have an intelligent discussion about this particular issue, and you could talk about gun registration, we could talk about training and so forth. But because of the extremists on the Democrat side who basically want clearly to get rid of the Second Amendment, they want to stack the Supreme Court, I could never support a ban. I just could never support a ban because they are showing me more than ever why there is a Second Amendment. Thoughts on this? My COS friends.
The First Amendment, pretty clear on what it says in there, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition, freedom of religion, etc. But they made the second one, right after the most important one, they made the second one the one to protect the first one. They made the Second Amendment so that every citizen can own a firearm in order to protect their rights.
Protect themselves and protect their property.
Absolutely.
So go ahead. What do you think?
I think some people read into the Second Amendment that it's in there for us to overthrow the government if we need to. I think there's more of the case that the framers put it in there because at some point maybe the government shouldn't be depended upon to protect us all the time and can't protect us all the time. So it's our right to be able to do that. And I think that gets lost in a lot of Second Amendment debate, that it's really not, it's about us as individuals able to protect ourselves without the help of anyone else. And I'm afraid that gets lost. The 3D printing aspect of it, Mark, I think he's looking at this as a way to not just, it's a stepping stone to something else that they want to, maybe they want a gun registry. I think 3D printed guns, they probably don't have a serial number. Maybe he could have just come up with some legislation to make sure the software can be used once. I don't know, I'm not a technical person that way, but each one, when it's used, gets a serial number. I think there's other ways to accomplish what he says he's trying to accomplish, which makes me very skeptical that he's not trying to accomplish what he says he's trying to accomplish.
So that's a great segue into what the bill actually says is, it makes it a Class C felony in Hawaii to purchase, manufacture, or otherwise obtain firearm parts for the purpose of assembling a firearm that has no serial number, amends certain requirements relating to firearms registration. So really, he's not interested in registering these firearms. He wants to ban them because he's making a felony to possess them to begin with. And so if he really wanted gun control, which is what he initially claimed that he wanted, then he would have put a registration requirement in. Yeah, you can make your own gun, you have to register it, right?
Yeah, Mark, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I will tell you that I've been looking into purchasing a firearm myself for home defense recently, over the last couple of, frankly, months now. And I can't get one, not because I can't get one with my background checks, I have a perfect background record, because they're just not available. Right?
They're sold out.
They're sold out. Very few are in stores. I mean, there are some. You can buy one, but you have to settle for whatever they have in store. If there's one particular one you want, or just a genre of ones you want, they're not available. And so, I mean, I don't have an opinion on 3D printed guns yet. I haven't put enough thought into that whole system and idea. But like I said, I can't get the gun that I want.
Which is fascinating, because I also hear that about ammo. That ammo is very, very difficult to get.
Or very expensive.
And
both.
There's a almost kind of like a waiting list for the ammo, which is really kind of odd, I got to tell you. So this is the Hawaii ghost gun ban, Senator Carl Rhodes, SB 2151. He wants to just ban them. And so podcast listeners, we're leading up to this. Here is the third of 3 clips from State Senator Carl Rhodes, who's really going to tell you now what he thinks about the Constitution of the United States. And here it is.
The federal Constitution has been interpreted to mean that you have an individual right to own a firearm. I think that decision is suspect because of what the amendment actually says. And there's a reference to a militia in there. I'm not sure. I think it's kind of ambiguous as to what it means, but it means something. So I don't know yet whether I think most of the country is still very much, there are big swaths of the continent that they love their guns. They're not going to give them up no matter what. There are other places.
So if you're listening to this guy really closely, really what he's saying initially is, he's just really afraid of ghost guns. That's why he gives it that really scary name of ghost guns. And then you listen more and more through his clips and you realize he doesn't believe in the Second Amendment because it talks about a militia, and he's not really sure if the Second Amendment relates to arming a militia. So read that again. What does the Second Amendment say?
A Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. And we have with us in this podcast and in this dumbest bill in America, 2 members of the Convention of States, which is so concerned about the Constitution of the United States being overwhelmed and overturned because of people like State Senator Carl Rhodes, who doesn't think that there is really a Second Amendment that applies to the people.
Yeah, the one thing I was disappointed to hear in that clip was he said there's a reference to militia. You know, if you're going to make an argument about your side of the opinion of this controversy, have the reference in front of you. I've read it twice now, and I'm going to read it again if I have to. But I'm also reading, just so happened you mentioned this, you brought it up today, I'm reading One Vote Away by Ted Cruz. And the 3rd chapter in there is about gun rights, and it specifically
and the One Vote Away refers to the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, many cases on the Supreme Court have been decided by a single vote. So that's who's on the Supreme Court actually matters. And so reading through the book, it talks about the Second Amendment and the wording in here. And the founders put the first part of it, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That is just a prefatory explanation of what is about to be established. That's all it is. What is established is the right of the people, and the founders mean the phrase, the right of the people, to mean individual rights. And it is also not only in the Second Amendment, it is in other places of the Constitution. And so oftentimes people will say individual right in this place, individual right in this place, but not individual right in the Second Amendment. It is an individual right. And what is that individual right? The right to bear arms shall not be infringed by the government.
Perfect. And here you are, a stellar citizen, right, with a great record, and
well,
you can't even...
Stellar is questionable.
You can't even buy a gun because of, presumably, the demand for guns, because of what's happening in the streets of America. And then Carl Rhodes, State Senator Carl Rhodes of Hawaii, saying, well, you know, there's a loophole in that whole gun buying thing, and the loophole is technology is allowing people to make their own guns, so we're going to shut that down and make it a felony to even do that. And so you can understand why people who really support the Constitution of the United States, like the COS people, the Convention of States people, which both of you are Convention of States leaders here in the great state of Maryland, but Convention of States is nationwide, you guys are fighting this great fight to let people understand what people like Carl Rhodes and the other Democrats actually think about the Constitution of the United States. Final thoughts on this from both of you.
Law-abiding citizens follow the law, right? So there's no reason, at least as far as the Second Amendment question goes, there's no reason to infringe the right of the people to bear arms.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say when you take guns away from law-abiding people, you're not taking them away from the people who are already breaking the law.
Perfect. And that's the Hawaii. Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, and Mark, I know you're concluding here, so I just wanted one final thank you for letting us join you on the podcast.
Absolutely.
A little plug for episode 105. You want to hear us talk about Convention of States again?
Very good.
ConventionofStates.com is our website if you want more information about our movement, right? There's a lot more we could talk about. There's even a Maryland-specific version of it if you put a /Maryland at the end.
And that's the dumbest bill in America, which is the Hawaii ghost gun ban. And good old State Senator Carl Rhodes of Hawaii, who doesn't believe that the Second Amendment gives you the right to keep and bear arms. Just unbelievable. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to Stephen Patten, State Director of Convention of the States, and Matthew Rehberg, also a volunteer at the Convention of States. And of course, our producer, Adam Couture, our assistant producer, Christopher Hawkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.